there's many strands to this discussion, and we're focusing on one, and that one is health, health effects. But we could equally have a long meeting about privacy. For instance, Merton Council, along with others, are bringing out sensors within the towns. Some are for good purposes, some are more questionable, but we don't really know what's acceptable use and what's unacceptable use. Currently, councils are partnering, most councils in London are partnering with the Innovator project. So it's a public-private partnership, and these, you could say, these sensors, some people call them IoTs, Internet of Things, they join together, they interconnect, and with many of these, that leads to the emergence of smart city. And it's in the government's policy papers that the vision for 5G is the smart city. Now, what does this mean? We've got to discuss this more. What does it mean for how we relate to one another, how we relate to our public bodies, the individual and the public body? How would that change? We have sensors in Merton on the boundary of our borough. The data, I think, is anonymized, but it tells people who's going, well, how many people are going out, how many people are coming in. And there was talk of trying to put it in parks, but the reason it wasn't put in parks was that there were not the poles or the infrastructure to make that easy. We could equally be talking about energy consumption. 5G is quite an energy, well, it's a very energy-hungry technology, and compared to fiber, it's many, many times. Compared to 4G, it's 3.5, 4 times. And that's a very conservative estimate. So we could be talking about that, and we have some leaflets, in fact, that is 5G green, because for some reason it is considered a green technology. And so this would sort of shed some light. It's a nice introduction to that area. So the other aspect of it is that it's more, the term is, it's a more densified technology. There'll be more transmitting bits of infrastructure, and what's lacking is that a whole life cycle approach from cradle to grave of these products are not looked at, the upkeep, the maintenance, and the replacement. Fibre is much more future-proof in that way. So that's another topic we could be going on to discuss another day, maybe. Wildlife. This does kind of intersect with what we're going to be talking today. Plant life, animal life. And, well, we have worked with friends, and we've interviewed scientists, and they were talking about studies that were around 15 years long that looked at the effects on animals and plant life. And these studies won many prestigious prizes as well, so they're very recognized studies. So those videos are available as well on YouTube. If you go to the Action Against 5G name, subscribe to that channel on YouTube, you can see those videos. It's a series of 3. So it talks about insects and different places, national parks, and how the effects were, both when the mask was there and when it was removed and before it was there. So today, yes, we're going to talk about health, and that's what we'll be largely discussing. And I think at this point we should say we're not against technology. Like everyone really, we want it to be safe, high-performing, reliable, efficient, have value for money, and private. So the technology itself should be intrinsic, should lend itself to privacy. It should be designed in a way that respects that. Okay, you can probably tell if I was given the choice, I would select full fibre rather than EMR technologies. And it's not just me, the government does feel the same way. There's something called the National Planning Policy Framework, and although in paragraph 114, although it sort of says you must not dissuade people from implementing 5G infrastructure for health reasons, it does say this: advanced high quality and reliable communications infrastructure is essential for economic growth and social well-being. Planning policies and decisions should support the expansion of electronic communication networks including next-generation mobile technology, such as 5G, and full fibre broadband connections. So support both wireless and full fibre, it's saying. But policies should set how high-quality digital infrastructure providing access to services from a range of providers is expected to be delivered and upgraded over time. And should, this is the important bit, should prioritise full fibre connections to existing and new developments, as these connections will, in almost all cases, provide the optimum solution. So it's not really in dispute that it's all the points I made before: safer, more higher performing, efficient, reliable, and private, and more value for money. In fact, it's more future-proof. You don't have to upgrade it so much. Even copper wire is very good for broadband. It's still, because the encoding techniques are always improving, and it keeps on surprising people. Okay, when that paragraph was drafted, it was unlikely that health concerns were a consideration, because the position currently that the PHE, Public Health England, and now UK Health Security, was it UK Health Security Agency? Yeah, HSA, UK HSA, yeah. Well, they see things as being fine. In fact, that we can be exposed to far more and be within the bounds of safety. But I, like Professor Chamberlin, was sceptical before I looked into this. I looked into this for a friend, and I looked into it because I was particularly worried about privacy. But when I looked at the health aspects, I found my friend was right. I was really shocked. I tried to allay his fears, and instead I found, when I was looking at both sides, and when I was looking at scientists who were independent, by that I mean didn't have potential conflicts of interest in their funding, overwhelmingly they were showing harm. And I was discussing earlier that physicists often, not all, don't see the harm because there's models showing no harm, but in the lab, biologists see harm all the time, and they are not talking to one another. So we need biophysicists, of which there are few, to really get to grips, or have both disciplines talking to one another. Okay, so on to our speakers, and that's why we're at this meeting at such short notice, because we heard that Dr. Kent Chamberlin was going to be with us, and Peter G.
David G.
Sorry, David G. My ex-colleague.
Big round of applause.
This is longer than I expected, because this is the credentials of both people. Professor Chamberlin specialises in computational electromagnetics. His research has been devoted to modelling radio wave propagation, including interfering radiation from computing devices, and wave phenomena in the human body. Dr. Chamberlin is the immediate past chair and Professor Emeritus in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of New Hampshire. In his more than 40 years in academia, he's performed research for over 25 sponsors, including the National Science Foundation. He has received 2 Fulbright Awards, including the prestigious Fulbright Distinguished Chair, which he served in Fierro, Portugal. He's also served as an Associate Editor for the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, and he regularly performs reviews for them and other technical and scientific publications. He served on the New Hampshire State Commission that was convened to evaluate how the state should respond to potential health and environmental impacts associated with the rollout of the 5th generation wireless communications infrastructure. He was appointed to this commission by the University of New Hampshire Chancellor. Since leaving the university, he has been a founder in a high-tech startup, and he has been working with legislators to implement the recommendations of the New Hampshire Commission. He's also serving as Vice Chair of the International Commission on the Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Fields. That's Professor Chamberlin. David G. He's the Visiting Fellow for the Centre for Pollution Control and Policy, Brunel University, London. He's the Fellow Collegium Ramazzini Institute, and he's part of the scientific expert group for the International Commission for Biological Effects of EMF. Throughout his career, David has worked at the interface of science and policy making in the fields of occupational health and environment, and I reached out to some unions. I hope some union reps are also here. And this is both in the UK with trade unions and NGOs and as an international civil servant. He developed and rolled out the national programme of safety reps, 10-day training courses before becoming the National Health and Safety Officer at the GMB Union. He then became director of Friends of the Earth before becoming a freelance consultant and TV presenter, Channel 4's Our Backyard series, between 1995 and 2012. He then became senior advisor on science policy and emerging issues at the European Environment Agency in Copenhagen. It's an independent data, information and knowledge providing institution of the EU. David initiated, I found David through this. David initiated and co-edited with over 80 expert authors of both volumes of the influential Late Lessons from Early Warnings reports. He was the author of some of the chapters, for example, More or Less Precaution. So this maps on historical parallels of how things were warned about, not listened to, some scientists disregarded, maybe smeared, and then found out to be the case later on, maybe, well, too late in many cases, such as asbestos. Okay, so that's the introduction, and I pass on to Professor Kent. Oh, David, David, sorry.
Took off as well. So with 4 weeks' notice, we decided we were going to give Kent a lecture tour of the UK. So it basically started last night in my mainly hometown of Bexhill-on-Sea with 120 people packed into an even hotter room. Great meeting, great kick-off. This is the second one. The third one is tomorrow afternoon at the Royal Society of Medicine, the top end of medicine in the UK, in Wimbledon Street. And that's a 3-hour section in the afternoon where we've got Kent and Erica, whom you'll hear about in a moment, plus an amazing guy called Professor James Lynn, who will zoom in from the University of Chicago. Some people are going there in person. Most of the people, so far 250 or more, are attending by Zoom. And they will hear, amongst other things, what you will hear tonight from the two speakers, plus James Lynn, who is a bit like, he was kind of a senior bishop in the Catholic Church, if you see what I mean. Well, let's call it the Church, before Galileo came along and said, actually, the Earth is not the centre of the world, it's the Sun, and we are just a small bit on the side, contrary to what the Bible was, blah, blah. And as you know, they tried to kill old Galileo unless he agreed not to spread those inconvenient truths anymore. So he was put under house arrest until he died. Well, James Lynn was a kind of bishop at that time, dead against Galileo, believing that non-ionizing radiations is absolutely safe. He was the editor of Bioelectromagnetics journal, he was the top professor, and he thought things were okay. And then he left IGNUR, left the church, went back to university, looked at the data again, and is now a Galileo. And he produced a paper only a month ago saying this stuff is probably certainly carcinogenic. And so he's moved a long way. So people like Vodafone and the telecoms industries and the British government are going to have to listen a bit more to a type of person like Kent as well, of course, but James Lynn, who's converted from being a high priest of the school that said there's no hazards to being one of the Galileos of our time. So if you'd like to zoom into that meeting tomorrow afternoon, it doesn't cost anything, etc. I want to give just a little bit of context. I did note with great delight the name of this organisation here, which has the words, it did anyway, Precautionary Principle in its title. This local Merton group has Precautionary Principle in its title. Back at the European Environment Agency in 1998, it was clear that people really didn't know much about what the hell the Precautionary Principle was. There were lots of different definitions, it was very confusing, and there was a great deal of confusion, blah, blah. So I thought, well, why don't we just look back in history at, let's say, the history of X-rays, or the history of asbestos, as a for instance, and then produce a book, which is this one here. Where's it gone? The one that was there it is. So this was volume 1 of Late Lessons from Early Warnings, the Precautionary Principle, 1896 to 2000. Why 1896? X-rays were discovered in 1895. Because X-rays are very powerful ionizing radiations, They were damaging the fingers and the hands of the early technicians 1 year later. So we knew there were short-term effects, acute effects, bad effects from X-rays 1 year later, hence the title 1896. It took before about mid-1920s, so nearly 20 years on, before somebody does a study of the people using the X-rays. They're called radiographers. So you go in and have your X-ray as a patient, and some person gives it to you. That's their full-time job, radiographers. Somebody says, whoops, they seem to have a lot of cancer. And so they did a big study in Britain in the 1920s and found 200-odd radiologists already were dying prematurely of cancer. So they then knew that this X-ray stuff gives short-term effects and long-term effects. Nothing much happened until 1948, when the world of radiographers got together to protect themselves, like a trade union really, and set up the International Commission on Radiological Protection, 1948-49. And they said 4 things. Number 1, there is no known safe level of exposure to a carcinogen like ionizing radiation from X-rays. So the following 3 principles were enunciated. Number 1, if you're going to use X-rays, you must, or ionizing radiation in an X-ray type form, you must justify its use, because it does give a cost. Now this struck a bell with me, because I remember as a little boy, being born in 47 and therefore growing up in the early 50s, you would wander into a shoe shop and you would put your foot into an X-ray machine, and it would give you a lovely picture, so the kids were delighted. There were my bones and my feet. Wow, isn't that fantastic? But it was an X-ray. So instead of measuring the foot of a little person with, say, a ruler, that'd be a good idea, they did it with X-rays for about 10 or 15 years. So this society said that use of X-rays is completely unjustified. The kids are getting a dose of radiation. There are other ways of measuring feet. So that was their first principle. Justify the use of a technology, because of its benefits being much greater than its likely costs. Second principle, if you do use it, as in X-rays in hospitals, where the patient clearly gets a benefit, optimize, that means make the best you can, of the doses, so that the patients get the least dose, and the radiographers get the least dose, but both parties get the greatest benefit. And that needs a bit of intelligence and engineering and all kinds of stuff like that can enable you to get a good X-ray without you getting too much cancer, and certainly the radiographers. So optimization was the second principle. And the third was allow, as low as is reasonably achievable. If you've done the first 2 steps, if you're still using X-rays, for example, in hospitals or whatever, try and work out how to keep the exposures as low as is reasonably practicable. Now, I spend some time on those 3 principles because there are 98-year-old scientists who have been in the ionizing radiation field for many years, and they are looking in astonishment at what's happening next door in this field, the subject of tonight, which is non-ionizing radiations, which basically means that the energy isn't sufficient to smash an atom to pieces, let's say, biologically. The other speakers will perhaps elaborate a bit more, but that's it. So because people have thought this stuff is low energy, they have thought not harmful. Completely and utterly wrong, as you will hear this evening. But the people who have been through the ionizing radiation field for 50 years or so are saying, why on earth are these people in the non-ionizing field, this field of telecommunications radiations, why are they not applying the principles of realizing there's no safe level for a cancer-causing substance, first of all, and then justifying the use of non-ionizing? On the marketplace out there, there are things like baby teethers that involve non-ionizing radiation. It's a bit like X-rays in school, in shoe shops before. Completely unjustified. So get rid of all the rubbish that's out there that's causing damage, because it's not needed. Secondly, if it is, reduce doses as much as you can, and the speakers will elaborate on that. Just stepping back, therefore, I said, let's learn something. So there's a chapter in here written by a top radiobiologist about the history of X-rays. 1896, the first early warning. 1920s, the first studies of lung cancer. 1948, the first principles of protection. And guess what? 10, 20 years later, the National Radiological Protection Board goes into our hospitals in the 1990s and just tries to apply these 3 principles and they measure differences between hospitals of 100 times between you getting an X-ray for, say, a broken wrist in one hospital and me getting an X-ray for a broken wrist in another hospital, and that those differences could be 100 times greater because of kind of sloppiness and not caring and not applying these three principles. So that makes the history of radiation. Very quickly, 1898, the first lady inspector puts asbestos down a microscope and says these fibres would kill workers. 1898. First big study, 1930, of asbestos workers in one of my plants in Rochdale. 66% have got asbestosis, which is a lung-clogging dust disease. 1950s, Sir Richard Dole, who discovered the connection between smoking and lung cancer, does a study of my members in the same factory, Rochdale, 1955, 10 times the lung cancer rate. So now asbestos causes two problems. 1962, a pathologist in South Africa notices that children playing with the waste tips of the asbestos mines in South Africa are getting a completely different, really horrible cancer called mesothelioma, which kills you within a year. Devastating. And so from 1964, we know for certain that asbestos gives asbestosis and lung cancer, more importantly, mesothelioma. The exposure limit set by the British experts in the 1960s completely ignored lung cancer and mesothelioma. They just set it on the basis of asbestosis, the old disease. And similarly, outrageous things are happening in this field, as you will learn. Consequently, we finally banned asbestos 100 years after the good lady inspector said it'll kill people. We did that about 1990. Now, 2023, if you go to the government site, Health and Safety Executive, and look up asbestos deaths, you will find 2,700 new deaths per year in the UK from mesothelioma. And because we know that there's one lung cancer at least, some say 2 or 3, for every mesothelioma, the current new death toll from asbestos last year is 5,000 deaths, which is more than twice the number of people we kill on the roads. This is why we wrote this first book. Can we not learn something from tragedies like this to make sure we don't do the same kind of mistake, make the same kind of mistake as we made with asbestos? And then finally, this was used a lot. Then people said to me, this is very comfortable. This is BSC, acid rain, hole in the ozone layer, asbestos, X-rays. Where are the new emerging issues like mobile phones and head cancers? When we published this around about 2001, a guy in Sweden, an oncologist, a man who gets patients in, saw that he was getting too many of a rare brain cancer called glioma. And he talked to the patients and said, where the hell is this coming from? And they said, well, Sweden was the second country in the world to have mobile phones after Israel, and my job has involved me doing this for about 15 years, and it's on the same side as the head as the tumour, so how about that as a possible cause? So he goes away and does a proper scientific case control study, publishes it in 1999, saying people who've used phones next to their heads, and you'll hear how important the distance from the head is later, they have a twofold excess, like twofold excess of brain gliomas on the side of the head where they use the phone, if they used it for longer than 10 years. That was the first early warning. And when I saw that, I thought, oh my goodness, we are heading for maybe another asbestos here, so we must do something about it. Since then, very quickly, we produced volume 2 of Late Lessons, which is here, where we looked at another, so that had 14 case studies. This tome has another 20 case studies, some well known, we know a lot about, but some were emerging. One was mobile phones and head cancer, written by Hardell, the man who did the study in 1999. This gets published in 2013, and by that time he's showing much greater risks, particularly for the young people in his group who had started using the phone, who were under 20 when they were diagnosed with the glioma, under 20. And he found they had a 4 to 5-fold excess risk of glioma if they were the young people. So we know, and you'll hear a bit about this later, why young heads are more sensitive to a given dose of radiation than our head or my head. And because you're young, when you get that dose, you've got 60 years to express a tumour, which is not great. Whereas if I start using a phone at 76, I needn't worry perhaps too much about developing a brain tumour because I'll be 97 anyway, so what the hell. But for younger people, the story is very different. And so what we've got tonight are two people who have done a tremendous amount of work. Kent on the 5G Commission for New Hampshire, where the politician said, "What is this all about?" And they said, "Well, Kent will tell you the story." But before him, I think Erica comes, is that correct? Or did she follow? Yeah, which? We don't know which way around it is.
I'll go first.
Okay,
like I
right.
did last
So Erica is Dr. Erica Mallory Blythe. She set up something called the Physicians' Health Initiative on these radiations some 3, 4, 5 years ago. She's now got 3,500 doctors in that group, and they are very concerned about the risks, particularly to young people, from this non-ionizing radiations. So she's down in, wherever she is, Crowborough, near to Bexhill. She turned up at the Bexhill meeting last night, but because of childcare, she's just zooming in, hopefully, after Kent has spoken. I've said enough in terms of broad context, so can I hand over to the now quite tired Kent, who flew in from New York. His flight was delayed 24 hours, so he's all been a bit of a helter-skelter, and he's got another 7 performances to do in the next 8 days, so he's going to be pretty tired. But this is day 2, so he's still quite fresh. Over to you, Kent.
So anyhow, getting on to my presentation, I've studied electromagnetic waves my entire career. Electromagnetic waves, radio waves. And in fact, early in my career, I even climbed antenna masts to make measurements on operating antennas. I've designed antennas, made measurements on antennas. In fact, you've written computer models to show how electromagnetic waves work. And I even designed an antenna that would be implanted in somebody's body to provide communication for an implanted device. So obviously, I didn't think there was a problem with electromagnetic radiation exposure. And then about 4 years ago, all that changed when I was asked to serve on a commission, and the purpose of that commission, as you've heard from previous speakers, was to explore the environmental and health impacts of wireless radiation exposure. Now, I think most of you know the outcome of what we found on the commission. In general, it's just that wireless radiation is indeed harmful. Now, that's the bad news. The good news is that there's a lot we can do about it. I'm using my phone, but I'm using it more carefully. And I'm careful about how I provide internet inside our house, and I'll talk about that a little bit more too. So, yes, there are problems, but there's a lot that we can do about it. But the first thing we have to do is to acknowledge that there is a problem. And that's something that industry isn't doing right now for reasons that may become obvious later. And in fact, I imagine you can guess what that reason is. It has to do with money. It would cost a lot more to do things right, to protect people. But that's not happening because that would cut into the industry's profits. So the next thing I think that you need to know is a little bit of a conflict of interest statement here. And that is, and the reason I feel like that is important, is that if you hear a presentation like the one we're giving tonight, but if you're hearing it from the telecommunications industry, what they will be telling you, surprise, surprise, is that wireless radiation is completely harmless. I've heard them say it many, many times, and they're getting paid to give you that message. My message is very different. You'll hear where that message comes from. So I'm not here getting paid to be here. I'm here out of a sense of commitment, because I realize that it's unlikely that you'll hear our message from too many other people. Well, people from the telecommunications industry are not going to tell you, and most of the media outlets aren't going to tell you either, because who do you think some of the major advertisers are for the news outlets? It's telecom. In fact, I believe it's the #1 advertiser in this country. And so those media outlets aren't going to say anything critical of the telecommunications industry, so you're not going to hear about it from them. So having said that, let's move forward in the things that we're going to cover in this presentation. I'm going to start off with a kind of a very, very quick overview of some of the technical questions that I've been asked in the past. So I'm not sure what your technical backgrounds are, but do you know how an antenna works or what an antenna does? Do you know the difference between an analog or a digital signal? So these are some of the things that I'd like to cover, and I say I'll be covering them pretty quickly because some of you may already know, but it forms kind of the background that is important if you're going to understand the other things I'm going to tell you about tonight. So let's move forward. The other things I'm going to tell you about, obviously, are the New Hampshire Commission that I served on, because it's important you know the background, and of course, you already know a little bit about the findings. Other things, are we're going to be talking about how the FCC guidelines, the threshold, and ICNIRP. Are you familiar with the term ICNIRP?
Yeah.
Okay, so you know ICNIRP. And they tend to find these two. The FCC is the Federal Communications Commission from the United States. And they tend to be in lockstep in terms of the standards or the thresholds they set for radiation exposure. So that's what I'm going to be getting into tonight. And finally, some recommendations, and then we'll have time for questions. I am trained, I think you heard before, my specialty areas are radio frequency engineering, electromagnetics, and so at the end, if there are questions, technical questions you have, I may be able to answer them for you. So this busy slide it tells about the frequency spectrum. And it tells what happens at what frequencies. Frequencies are cycles per second, and they define an electromagnetic wave, and define a lot about its radiation characteristics. So there is a relationship between frequency and the size of a wave. And I'm obviously not here to give you a lecture on electromagnetics, thank God, right? But I am here to give you just some of the basics. And then when you get up to AM radio, it goes up to about 1 megahertz. That's 1,000,000 cycles per second. Then when you get into FM radio, it's 100 times more, 100 megahertz. And this is what's written on the left there. And then you get up to microwave frequencies, your cell phone, and that is about the same frequency as your microwave oven, which is 2.45 giga. That's 1 billion cycles per second. So we're going up in frequency, and the frequencies that are of most interest in terms of cell phone and wireless radiation are, as you can see there, maybe you can't see there, between 300 megahertz and 6 gigahertz. So that's what we, as the commission, looked at in terms of frequency. I should point out, and some of you may know this, but that is light is electromagnetic waves, is comprised of it. So there's a little narrow window there you can see with the rainbow on the right that represents frequencies that contain light, or where light is present. So we can't see anything other than light, which is at the frequency shown right there. Another concept is the characteristics of wireless signals. You know, what do we mean by wireless radiation, and what makes it different from other types of radiation? But basically, any of these high frequencies devices that we've come to learn to love are going to be wireless radiation. And what it does is it takes a signal and it breaks it up into little tiny packets and sends them out as packets. And they're completely, or very much different in characteristics from the old analog waves. And examples of that, for those of you old enough to remember, are like the AM radio. You tune it in, that's an analog signal. And FM radio, an analog signal. And early television, the same thing, analog signals, where you have a wave that doesn't start and stop. But when you get into digital, here's a plot of it. Here is a plot of your cell phone, what the signal looks like for your cell phone receiving a phone call. So the first thing that occurs is what's called handshake. So the cell tower sends out a signal, hey you're about to get a phone call, and when you start ringing, let's start making sure that we know where you are, and also what your radiating power is. So there's a lot of information that gets sent back and forth between your cell phone and the cell tower. And so you get this pattern, and each of one of those little spikes of information, so it's not continuous, but and by the way, this plot is a function of time. And if you were to take a look at 4 of those little spikes, it would look something like this. Now, the importance of this plot, conceptually, in terms of the harms of wireless radiation, is that this type of impulsive radiation is much more harmful than waves that are continuous, because these little spikes look like jackhammers to biological cells. So when somebody talks about wireless radiation, they're talking about radiation that is impulsive in nature. So just what's the difference between different types of wireless signals, and we can talk about modulation, modulating schemes, and different frequencies and all that. But basically, and the point I want to make here is that all of the devices that you consider that we currently use, like baby monitors, your cell phone, cell towers, and by the way, cell towers radiate the same types of signals as your cell phone. So they're sending signals back and forth. The thing on this slide that again, you can't read, but are important for you to know, is the power that's associated with various devices. For example, with your cell phone, it can range between 600 milliwatts and 3,000 milliwatts. 3,000 milliwatts, 3 watts. That's a lot of power. It's a microwave transmitter you're holding in your hand. And yet when you look at other devices like Bluetooth and cell phone, what's the other one? Wi-Fi in general, their maximum transmit power is about 100 milliwatts, so a tenth of a watt. So knowing how to use a device, if you can use the lowest power device possible, you're going to be protecting yourself as much as you can. If you want it or if you choose to use the device. And we can talk more about that later. But the choice about how to use your devices should be yours, and you should know how to protect yourself. Oh, just another point there. Radiation from all the devices, baby monitors, cell phones, they're all harmful, potentially harmful. And we've known about this for many, many years. There's been a study in the Vatican radio. There were cancer clusters around this very powerful transmitter that we call Vatican radio. So it's not something that we just learned. It's something that we've known for a long, long time. We could spend a whole hour talking about how long we've known about it. So let's move on to antennas. This is just a picture of one antenna, and it may look familiar to you, or you may have seen antennas like this. So I'm showing one that's mounted on top of a tower, and as you can see, it has, it looks like it's divided into 3 different segments going around the antenna. So if you took a top look, or first of all, answer the question, what does an antenna do? It acts like a flashlight in terms of directing energy where you want it. So if I wanted to look over in this direction, I would point my antenna or my flashlight in that direction, and the same thing I can point it in the other direction. So what an antenna looks like, at least a 4G antenna, is something like this. So we're looking at a top view of an antenna, and what you can see here is that we have 3 different antennas, and each one covers a 120-degree sector. And the reason for this is so that you can get greater reception in one area, and you won't get any reception in another, which allows the antenna to service 3 times as many customers. Because now you're going to be, if you're in one of these sectors, you're going to receive a great signal, you'll be able to communicate with the cell tower, and other people can be in other sectors and not cause interference. Another thing an antenna does, like the one you're looking at, like the ones you see all around you, is that it gives you direction in the side view also. And in particular, you don't want an antenna that's going to be spreading out radiation to the clouds, because there aren't any customers up there, there aren't any users up there, so you don't need to. So let's focus the energy where it belongs. Now there's nothing wrong with this, but I just wanted you to have some understanding of how an antenna works, because that's a big part of, well, it's one of the things that we looked at in the New Hampshire Commission, is let's understand a little bit about the technology, and these are questions that I've received in the past. The other thing is, to be clear, an antenna doesn't change the signal, the frequency, or the modulation. It doesn't make any change to the signal. It just focuses it in a particular direction. Now, let's talk about the New Hampshire Commission. And that's what I'm here to talk about, right? And how long is it taking me to get there? Anyhow, the reason the commission came about in the first place is that legislators were hearing from people in the wireless industry that wireless radiation is totally harmful. Did I say harmful? Totally harmless. So it's totally harmless, and your state needs to put out, roll out new facilities unless you want to go back to the Stone Age. And that's what they said, and you've probably heard them say the same thing. And so, and then the constituents for those legislators were saying, nah, that's not true. We are being harmed, and here's the scientific evidence to prove it. So, who do you believe? And legislators in New Hampshire, like legislators probably everywhere, are really overwhelmed with legislation. In fact, in the state next to us, legislators, have to deal with like 2,000 pieces of legislation, 2,000 bills per year. So the reason I'm saying that, and letting you know that, is that they don't have the time to delve into a problem like wireless radiation, which seems to many of them to be really complex. And in some ways it is, but in some ways it's pretty straightforward. So they were hearing these 2 different things, and they thought, well, let's find out the truth. Well, how would you find out the truth? Well, you want to bring together unbiased people Okay, we can do that. We have to find experts, people who really understand this problem. Let's form a commission to do that. And so in order to form a commission in the state of New Hampshire, you have to go through both houses of the legislature with legislation. And by the way, this is the first slide I have with a hyperlink on it. These slides will be made available to you. And so as you get those slides, they will be in PDF format. You can bring them up and click on the links, and you can see the things that I'm talking about right here. And one in particular is the legislation that formed the commission that I'm going to be talking about, the main theme of my presentation. This was the first time in the United States that a commission was formed to look at wireless radiation. And I'm happy to tell you that this is not the last thing. We are not the last thing, because now we have Massachusetts and New York and Maine that are also seeking to form their own commissions to kind of back up what we're saying, what we said in New Hampshire. I mentioned that it was, this legislation was passed by both houses of the legislature and signed by our conservative governor. And the reason I'm telling you that is to let you know this is serious. I hadn't known what it took to form a commission before I served on this one. You know, I thought it was maybe something that the governor said, oh, let's form a commission to look at it. It's not that. You have to get a buy-in from a lot of constituents, and that's what happened in this case. So we ended up with 13 commission members. Now, most of us were scientists and people who had worked on things relating to wireless radiation. We also had 3 people from industry, and we got the expected result from them. In other words, they didn't agree with our results. But that's where, we felt we couldn't have a commission to address wireless radiation without bringing on board people from industry. So what we ended up with were people, we had 2 doctors, 2 medical doctors, that actually were legislators as well. There are people in physics, toxicology, electromagnetics, epidemiology, biostatistics, occupational health, public health policy, business. So the point I'm trying to make here is we had a lot of expertise on this commission, and none of us were getting paid to serve. And I say that as though it's important, because it is. And I think you've all seen that with confirmation bias. If you pay somebody to do something, they'll come up with the result you want in too many cases. We weren't paid, but I accepted people from industry, and they were paid, and they came up with what the industry wanted to tell them. Anyhow, the bottom line is we had the expertise to answer the questions that were being asked of us. And what were those questions? These are going to be familiar to you, maybe. And that is, why does the insurance industry recognize wireless radiation harm, but it will not insure for damages caused by it? Doesn't that say a lot? The insurance company, they won't insure it because they know it's going to be a problem. Whoa. And that really got a lot of people's attention. But why have the many hundreds of peer-reviewed studies showing harm from wireless radiation been ignored by IGNR and the FCC? They ignore them. They completely disregard them. Why have the guidelines, the FCC guidelines, which I'll talk more about in a moment, are they based solely on thermal effects? Now, we know about thermal effects, and certainly that can be harmful. I mean, you put things in your microwave oven all the time. That's an example of microwave heating. And we know that you don't want to do it to too great a degree, otherwise you wouldn't want to be in a microwave oven, because it is harmful. But that's the only effect that's being considered by the FCC and IGNR in setting their guidelines currently, and I'll talk more about that. Why does the WHO, the World Health Organization, why do they classify wireless radiation as a possible carcinogen? And the FCC and IGNR simply ignore that. It's like it's totally benign, and it's not. So the next thing you might say, matter of fact, let me ask you a question. If you got asked to serve on a commission, you have expertise in one area, but you're asked to serve on a commission for a very complex issue, what would you do? What would be the first place that you would look to get good information? Now, the first thing we looked at was peer-reviewed information. Are you familiar with the term, are you happy or comfortable with the term peer-reviewed? Okay, I got it. So there are really lousy journals out there. I know about them. And as a department chair, I had to evaluate the quality of journals for some faculty coming in. And so if they were coming in, they were claiming lots of publications. You have to look at the quality of those journals where they made their publication. You may not know it. I mean, it's usually hard to get something published because you have to go to reviewers, and it's just a challenge. But there are journals out there they let them all in. They pass them, they approve them all. And one reason they're doing that increasingly is because, can you guess how that's a theme that will be coming up? Because of money. For many of these, they're referred to as predatory journals. You pay them money, they'll publish your article. And so that we know how to look out for things like that. And so that's one thing that we did to make sure that the articles that we used were of very high quality. And we can talk more about that if people have particular questions. Another source of information, regulatory agencies, the Federal Communication Commission, the Food and Drug Administration, the Environmental Protection Agency. They're out there to protect us, right? People don't look like they're agreeing too quickly. So we asked them to join us. And what happened? They didn't show it. So we asked them to meet with the commission, but they didn't meet with us, and they didn't provide the information we asked. Now, when you think about that for a moment, we were a commission, a state commission, formed by legislation, signed by the governor, and all that good stuff. But these federal agencies would not meet with us. Now, you may say, hey, Kent, wait a minute. You list regulatory agencies as sources of information, yet they didn't show with you. Why are you listing them as a source of information? But doesn't that tell you a lot? The fact that they wouldn't meet with us? So you invite them, they don't show up. Yeah, we take that into consideration, and that makes sense when you look at the rest of what I'm going to say. But we also brought in outside experts, people recognized with a scientific background in the relationship between exposure to wireless radiation and health. So we brought these people in, brought in 9 experts to talk with us. And all of those experts, except for one, claimed that there was harm with exposure to wireless radiation. The one presenter who did not acknowledge the problem, the risk from wireless radiation, was the one that was paid the telecommunications industry. Not surprising. So everybody else, all of the other presenters, were not paid, they did it on their own. This guy who came from the wireless industry, they flew him out from Pittsburgh to Durham, New Hampshire, to Concord, New Hampshire, and he says, no problem. And in the end, he even volunteered to put his head inside of a microwave oven. I wish we had taken him up on that. But when I'm not meaning to malign an industry, but just I'm reacting a little bit because I've heard so many things from the wireless industry. For example, they claim, and I've heard this, I can't even tell you how many times, the presenters from the wireless industry say that the articles that show harm from wireless radiation exposure are those that are cherry-picked from fringe journals. So one thing that we did is we looked at, as I mentioned, we did vetted the peer-reviewed articles that we used. And what we identified were hundreds of top-tier publications that showed harm from low-level wireless radiation, like what you get out of your cell phone. So, no, it's not like they're only in fringe journals. No, not at all. We found hundreds of articles from top-tier journals. And the next one is that it's not that we're cherry-picking. It turns out that the majority of articles do show harm. And in fact, over 90% of the articles that we looked at that looked at the effects of oxidative stress, I'll say more about that in a moment, over 90% of the articles did show harm from exposure. So let me go back to the statement by the wireless industry that the only articles that show harm are those that are cherry-picked from fringe journals. This blows that out of the water. Anybody who tells you that is simply woefully misinformed, or they are, how do you put it politely? I can't put it. They're lying to you. But I think you know that. So because I'm going to say a little bit more, actually I'll say it right now, about oxidative stress. Is this a term that you're familiar with? Free radicals?
Yes.
I eat my blueberries, I don't want my free radicals, and vitamin C helps with it also. And the reason is you want to lower your body's loading of free radicals. So what do we know about free radicals? They lead to inflammation, premature aging. There are a lot of bad things. And so if you're asking what does the wireless radiation do to you, like your cell phone, it can cause premature aging and the diseases. And I might as well go to the next slide, shown on this slide right here. So here are some of the, and by the way, I have links to each, for each of these bullet points, the disease, and I have an article linked to it, where it shows that relationship between exposure to low-level wireless radiation and the disease shown. Neurodegenerative disease, such as Alzheimer's. We know that Alzheimer's is greatly increased in not only America, but in this country right here. Cancer, that's increasing. Cardiovascular disease, diabetes. Diabetes is going off the charts in our country, and I think the same is true here. And there's an association between exposure to wireless fields, that oxidative stress, those free radicals, and these diseases. Other reproductive diseases, including sperm damage. So if you put sperm in two test tubes, and expose one to a wireless phone, and the other you put somewhere away from radiation exposure, you will see a marked difference in motility and the health of the sperm. So that's just an example. I get to the part of the presentation where I have to take a deep breath each time I go over this. And I don't mean to be overly dramatic, but I think that when you see this, you'll agree with me that I'm not being overly dramatic. So what I'm going to show you here are how the guidelines were set for the irradiation exposure thresholds that are currently in place today. And I say this every time I show people this, and it continues to shock me, so I'll just throw it out there. It was performed on animals in animal study, and in particular it was performed on 8 rats and 5 monkeys. That's extent. Anybody that knows anything about epidemiology knows that you want to use a large number of whatever it is you're testing things on. So in this case, we had an N of 13, 8 rats, 5 monkeys. And I have it all blasted here, it's written down, but let me walk you through how they made the test. Well, the first thing is what assumptions they made in performing these tests. Well, one is that they assumed that it was any bad effects that would occur were only due to heating. That's assumption number one. I should also mention that these tests that I'm going to tell you about took place in less than an hour. Now we're being exposed 24/7. This is a lifetime exposure that we're getting. The rules to define how high those can be were made back in the 1980s, and they were based only on short-term tests. So here's the test they did. They took these animals. These animals were trained to be able to push a lever and get food. Okay, and so then they food deprived these animals, and they put them in a cage, and they began exposing them to increasing levels of radiation. Ramping it up, and of course the animals, because they were hungry, they were pushing the lever, getting more food, and then finally, they stopped pushing the lever because they're getting heat exhaustion. This makes you hotter. Exposure to radiation of that intensity makes it hotter. In fact, some of the monkeys had burns on their faces from these tests. It's pretty shocking. And then when they finally reached the point where the animals couldn't do their work, they defined that level of radiation as being the upper threshold, or the threshold dosage for radiation exposure. I mean, this is true. I'm not lying to you, and I can point you to references like the one given on this slide, where you can read about it. But that's how these radiation thresholds were set. Now, that's the upper limit that I talked about finding, the threshold dose. And then they said, okay, well, we need to put in a safety factor. That's what they call it. If you hear them present, they'll call it a safety factor. It's based upon no science whatsoever. They picked a number out of there and said, well, let's make it 50. 50 for the population in general, and then 10 for workers. And so I think you can see why I am shocked by this. Are you shocked by it too? Yeah, and because that's how it was set. So having said that, well, let's talk about the effect the radiation can have on people. Let me show you some epidemiology, and that is a study of how radiation affects people and what are the effects of a cell tower, of living near a cell tower. So let's talk about the epidemiology. And let's go back to Israel. No, this is Brazil, back in the 1996 to 2006 era. And the death rates from cancer versus people, the distance people live from a cell tower. So this is a study This is one of many studies, but I think this one really illustrates the relationship between how close you live to a cell tower, the degree of exposure you have to wireless radiation fields, and an effect that it can have on your health. So this is the article, and if you get the slides, you can simply click on it and read the whole article. It explored the relationship, as I just mentioned, between cancer rates and how close people lived to a cell tower. And it was straightforward in what they did. I think you know that everybody's address is in a government database somewhere, and the cancer death rate is also available. So they took the two databases. It wasn't a perfect study, but it certainly gives you a good idea of what's going on. And so it correlated how close you live to a cell tower and the rate of cancer. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward, and I'll be able to show you the results with one single plot. This happened, by the way, I mentioned the N of 13 for how the standards were set. Well, this study that I'm talking about right now from Brazil involved a large number of deaths, over 7,000 cancer deaths. And it involved over 800 cell towers. So we have a large number of data here, which gives you a good sense of what's going on. It gives you a good degree of confidence that you have something that is statistically significant. Mentioned that this has occurred between 1996 and 2006, and the reason I think that's good is that the people in that area, not a lot of people, had their own cell phones at that time. And the reason that's significant is that it means that this is what I'm about to show you shows the relationship between living near a cell tower and a health outcome. And it was not affected by the people's own wireless devices, because that's a claim that the cell industry sometimes said they will make. You've probably heard it, and that is, oh, your own phone is a lot more dangerous than living near a cell tower. Well, let me show you the data and then let you decide. This plot really tells you everything about the study. The red trace is for people who participate in the study, and they represent cancer deaths. The blue line represents the cancer rate for the population in general. And clearly, as you move out farther and farther, you live farther and farther from a cell tower, your cancer rate becomes the same as the population in general, as it should, if the study is done correctly. So other things to point out, there's a dose-dependent relationship between cancer rate and exposure, exposure increases obviously as you get closer to a cell tower. So this says a lot. And what it says is that as you live closer and closer to a cell tower, you're more and more likely to die of cancer. It's just that simple, and it's a pretty straightforward way of analyzing it. So another thing that comes up, and I'll be talking about it later, is that we, the New Hampshire Commission, came out for a recommendation about how far people should live from a cell tower. And we tried to put forward legislation that mandated that. And that distance from a cell tower, what we chose was 500 meters. Is that perfect from the chart that you're looking at? You can see that 500 meters is near a break point in the curve. And where would you want to live? I want to live 10 kilometers from a cell tower myself. But you can see that if you are at 500 meters, yes, your relative risk is greater than if you lived a few kilometers from a cell tower. But we as a commission felt that was a reasonable, and this is a word that we used a lot, reasonable. A reasonable distance to live from a cell tower, and a reasonable distance for a setback for a cell tower. It wasn't perfect. You're not going to please everybody. And by the way, for those of you who have your own meters and are a little bit familiar with exposure levels, for a typical cell tower, at a distance of 500 meters from that cell tower, your exposure is going to be around 100 microwatts per meter squared. Just a data point, something for you to think about. So this is a meta-study, and the reason I'm following up this previous slide with a meta-study is people can say, well, I don't like the Brazil study, it's not accurate. Well, this meta-study, I don't know if you're familiar with the term, but a meta-study is a study where you take all of the previous, or all of the quality data from previous studies, combine it all together to come up with results that have greater statistical significance. So in this case, somebody took 38 studies the effects of living near a cell tower, combined them all together, and came up with findings. And as you can see, about 3/4 of the study showed that people living near towers getting radiation sickness. About 3/4 of them had other biological markers that changed from living near a cell tower. There are a number of them. They also showed negative impacts to trees. I got to say that had an impact on us in the New Hampshire Commission, knowing that trees will degrade and die when they're living near a cell tower. I can show you studies like that, but I'll save you for that right now. That had an impact on us. And finally, what showed up in that meta-study is a suggestion that 500 meters is a reasonable setback distance, a reasonable distance to live near a cell tower, 500 meters. So that'll come again. Finally, ways to lower your exposure. I think we've talked about a little bit of it. We could spend a whole day talking about that. Use wired connections. I did that in my house. In fact, it was back in the 90s. The internet's out, all these neat things you can do. So I wired our house with Ethernet cable. And it worked great, but then wireless came in. Remember, I thought it was fine to use wireless. I use wireless. I wanted gangbusters, wireless routers, wireless everything. And then as I joined the commission, as I mentioned, my whole attitude about wireless exposure changed. So I went back to that old 1990s wiring Ethernet cables and all that, plugged my computer in, and of course I got no radiation because I was using wired connections. I was surprised by how blindingly fast it was when I went into wired connections. So I just encourage you, that's something that we recommend in terms of the energy efficiency. It's fantastic. And also, there are lower emission devices that are coming out. As people recognize that there's a problem with wireless radiation exposure, they're doing things, things like going to lower radiation devices. And then finally, there are modifications to cell phones. And we as engineers, when we were told to design these things, nobody said, do it with low radiation. Not at all. What were they looking for? Blindingly fast speed. They didn't care about radiation. And so if we as engineers, are asked to come up with phones that have much lower radiation, we can do it. It just takes the will to do it, and it takes acknowledging that there is a problem. So my concluding remarks, a formal state commission of unbiased experts came to the conclusion that wireless radiation is harmful. You know that. And then the technological developments, I really promote them. Remember, I'm a person who's in technology, and I believe in technology, but I want to continue using it, but I don't want to create harm to myself or anybody else. So we can do this. And finally, if you're in a position to put in ordinances that protect people, I strongly encourage you to do so. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for mentioning baby monitors. I talked to a lot of people in my family about baby monitors, and I think I've persuaded most of them to stop the baby monitors.
Good.
But I wonder if you have any views on ultrasound scanning of babies, which is going berserk at the moment.
So what you're asking about is ultrasound, which is generally vibrations of sound. Generally in a few megahertz, although some of the newer devices are higher frequencies. Unfortunately, that's outside of my area of expertise, and we didn't look at them.
Yeah.
So I really don't know. I don't even know if there's any good epidemiology. Are you aware of any?
There is a lady in America that I've been in contact with who's written a book called The Dark Side of Ultrasound, and I can give you the reference for that.
I'd like to see it, yes.
Yeah, and she's very concerned, but she's been banned from Amazon and she can't get a voice anywhere.
What you're saying is really important for everybody to hear, and that is if you come up with a view like the one that we're talking about now, they do shut you down. And they can do it pretty easily because there is so much money behind things like telecommunications, obviously, and those who designed equipment like ultrasound. And that's something that we as a community have to deal with. I'm kind of surprised I haven't been shut down at this point. So sorry I couldn't answer your question, but I understand why you might not be able to get much information about it. Except to say one other thing, and that is sometimes these companies, they will go they obviously have a staff of people who look out for things that put their technology in a bad light. And then they will shut them down because they have connection with companies like Amazon. Most unfortunate.
Even talking with very open pre- and perinatal people, they find that a bit too upsetting to even go there.
Yeah, that's a good point. I've worked with a lot of, in fact, you're about to hear from a physician, Erica Mallory Blind, and she'll give you some insights that you need to hear from somebody who is a physician.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hello. Does the radiation accumulate in the body?
So I can, a good answer for that is yes, and I need to say why. Remember I said free radicals are something that happen when you're exposed to wireless radiation. Your body also generates more free radicals when you smoke cigarettes. And so I think of it kind of like smoking cigarettes. The longer you smoke, the longer you're exposing your body to free radicals, and so that will have a cumulative effect. So my answer is yes.
And how would you detox from that? Does grounding or anything like that help at all? Or is that again not something that...
Well, we have probably people here with EHS, and in fact, I don't have EHS, electromagnetic hypersensitivity. But so if I say something that you people with EHS disagree with, let me know. So the detox idea is that you simply get away from radiation exposure. And how do you do that? I mean, if you're living in a city, that would be a challenge. I would suggest getting your own meter, and we have a couple of them up here. Get your own meter and find locations in your house or wherever where you sleep. It may be that you find places outside that you go. You need a meter because sometimes it will surprise you. I went on big measurements in the woods not long ago, and I was surprised by how much radiation exposure there was. But a basic answer is to detox. You have to be away from radiation. Some people say that if they're away from radiation, the general sense of exposure goes way down, and then they're able to deal with it better when they come back and are exposed, for example, at work. Some people have told me the opposite, that if they go to an area where there's not exposure and then they come back, it's even worse. Can anybody share their insights about this? Yes?
I mean, one person, an electrician said to my mum that you're meant to actually turn the Wi-Fi off 3 days a week in your house. And that is also, or turn it off at least at night. And then that kind of stops. Well, that's what the person who created the work said to her she should do.
Well, actually, I'm glad you brought that up. I fully agree that turning off the Wi-Fi router, in fact, in these presentations that I made before, I've mentioned that. Turn off electronics at night. I don't want to take up too much time. We have Eric.
Can I just ask one more thing?
Yes, sir.
I'm a builder and I'm trying to work out a way that in a bedroom that I can seal that off. What material would I use to line the walls and the ceilings, if there are any materials?
In fact, I'll comment on that because that's a danger.
Right.
Think about it. If you have you're in a room that has things that keep wireless radiation out, it also keeps it in. So one problem that people have gotten into is they've put up the shielding, and then somebody will come on with an electronic device, and you can't always tell that you have an electronic device. But that radiation then gets trapped inside the room like a reverberation chamber, and it makes the radiation.
How would you extract that out? Would you have to have a seals unit to do that? So in other words, if you made it, and then you're saying radiation is trapped inside it, obviously that radiation could leave because if it's trapped inside.
Yes.
How would you then get rid of it? Or would it have to be a sealed unit so it wouldn't be functional?
Well, you get rid of the source of the radiation. And the reason I'm advocating getting a meter of your own is that you can't tell. You can't go out and buy an appliance nowadays, it seems, without that appliance having an Internet of Things device on it, a wireless device. You buy a refrigerator, even a washing machine. Have you noticed this? So the reason I'm bringing that up is that you can't buy a device nowadays, or an appliance nowadays, without having wireless something built into it, is because you can have sources of radiation around you don't even know about.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I think you misunderstand.
Oh, I
I mean a room that has got nothing in it
Oh, okay.
whatsoever. And the best materials for that. So if it's a sealed area.
Yeah, so I think you're probably safe there, but please bring in a meter to confirm it.
Yeah, 100%. But is there a material that you would say to use?
Oh, there are paints that are available, so there are devices that are, and we can talk about that later on. I'm not expert.
Sorry.
Sorry, you're saying to get away from it, but for us, we worked really hard and we finally managed to get a house. After 2 months of moving, I got a letter from Free Network. They're going to install a 5G mouse post, 2.2 meter for my children's bedroom. And I cannot argue, and I'm trying to object it with the government. They say they would not take health reasons into consideration. It will only, they can only object it on site and apparent. So I don't understand why the government's not doing something and letting them put in a pole 2 meter from the kid's bedroom.
I hear this story and I'm shocked every time I hear it because children should not be exposed. The only thing I can tell you, you may have to fight it. I know people who have fought these towers for years, and sometimes they're successful, sometimes they're not. Find some way to do your best to protect the children. They are the most vulnerable, as we'll hear in a moment from Dr. Mallory White.
And that was challenged by a judicial review by people in the area. And Brighton withdrew from that case and had to pay costs. And the judgment was that they did have to take account of health issues. So there's a big legal battle going on with the government at the top saying you have to ignore environment and health, and some of the local courts saying, wait a minute, this is ridiculous. And then there's a couple of cases similar to that in the States, and Kent, you mentioned it today about Pittsfield, where they made, where that particular local authority said, we are going to take into account health and environment of our people in our town. And that was challenged in the courts, and the court has said they can do that, if I've got the essence of it right. So you're getting the beginnings of fight back at local level through local courts, local tribunals, driven by parents like that one there, who quite rightly say it is just unacceptable for your democratic rights to be taken away by a government at the top that says you can only object to a 5G mast on grounds of visual stuff, and not on grounds of environment and health. So it needs pushing back. It's just a matter of time. All these case studies show that things do go in our direction. It might take 100 years or less, and in the case of meetings like this, you can accelerate that and make sure that within the next year or two, things are going to change. James Link going from the church to Galileo, some cases being settled in Italy at high levels, Turin appeal court, worker, acoustic neuroma, that's a kind of benign tumour behind the ear, goes to get occupational benefits, saying, I've been doing this for 15 years and my acoustic neuroma has been caused by this radiation. And the court said, absolutely, just at the level of balance of probabilities. If I can just spend 1 second on this, it's important to know there are different strengths of evidence for different purposes. In a compensation court case where you've already got a damaged person, in general, Western societies say you only have to show on a 51% probability that your damage was caused by that employer activity or by that instrument. Whereas in a criminal court, where you've got somebody who might be a murderer or might not be a murderer, we go to a much higher level of evidence, and we say, beyond all reasonable doubt, is this person a murderer or not? That means, using that strength of evidence, the key question always is, what are the costs of being wronged and who bears them? So in a criminal court, we have somebody who is assumed to be innocent, and we want to put them in jail if they are a murderer. We strive for a very high strength of evidence, knowing the consequences are sometimes a real murderer will go free. And we decide ethically and morally it's better to let a murderer go free than to hang or put in jail for 30 years an innocent person. It's an ethical question. And when we go to the lower courts, we've got an injured party, we say give the benefit of the doubt to the person with the tumour, because if we get it wrong, and really it wasn't Motorola's phone that caused that tumour, the insurance companies pick up the bill. Whereas if it's wrong in the other direction, you've got a poor person with a brain tumour who doesn't get compensation. So which strength of evidence do you play with at any point in time is critical, which is where the precautionary principle comes in. Because it says, you as a government or or you as a civil servant and you as the judge can determine on the basis of a precautionary principle which says give the benefit of the doubt to the people who might get damaged. And so you can take action somewhere between balance of probabilities or reasonable certainty, but do not wait for the scientific issue which makes for great science. I.e., if you're a scientist, you only want to say that A causes B when you're very, very certain. Because otherwise, at the cost of being wrong, your scientific reputation is ruined. So from the point of pure science, you go for a high strength of evidence, 95% certainty or thereabouts, a bit like the criminal courts, beyond all reasonable doubt, as a scientist. But as a policymaker, at local, national, regional level, your job is different. You've got to protect people and the planet. If you wait for beyond all reasonable doubt from pure science, it's too late. By the time you get that evidence of hundreds of people with cancer, like those radiographers in 1928, it's too late to save them. So as a decision maker, you decide what is an appropriate strength of evidence to use to move forward. And you've heard from Kent, and you'll hear more from Erica, that there is somewhere between balance of probabilities and pretty damn near certain evidence about both short-term effects, which you'll hear a lot from America, and certainly long-term effects in terms of reproductive damage, sperm, and cancer. So that's what the precautionary principle does for you. It helps you to take decisions in context of uncertainty and some scientific ignorance in ways that basically protect people and the planet. If you wait for beyond all reasonable doubt of the criminal courts or good science, it's all too late. Thank you.
Can we take more questions? Take more questions.
Oh yeah, I'll take questions.
Yeah, do another question.
Go ahead.
Yes, sir.
Just a very quick question. Can't think of the person to ask. Over a conversation in the pub, what to do about radio masts and signals. The question came up: would a mirror reflect the waves?
Well, the answer is yes. You can. It will be local reflection. But if you think that you could put a mirror in front of you to protect yourself, it probably wouldn't work because of a mechanism called diffraction. So the electromagnetic energy hits the edges of that window or that mirror or that conductor, diffracts around, and you still get it just like light. If you held up light and you put a mirror in front of it, a small mirror, you'd see what's called knife-edge diffraction that would give you light behind the mirror, even though the direct path was being obstructed by the mirror.
So was there another type of mirror that you
Smart television, that's like a mirror, isn't it?
Well, you have to. Well, we're getting into what's called a Faraday shield, and maybe more technical. I can certainly address your questions afterwards. But if you enclose yourself completely by something that is conductive, be it copper sheeting or a mirror, or some sort of metal, yes, the electric field goes to zero inside, and that is referred to as a Faraday shield. But it's hard to build one. And how many people want to sleep inside of something like that?
That lady with the kitty.
You're doing it?
No, the lady with the kitty probably was.
Actually, I wish we could get the companies to pay for that.
I wanted to ask a few questions. First of all, I heard that mobile data, to use that is better than Wi-Fi. What's your views on that? To turn off?
Well, since we have time, I'd like to answer your question because it's a very important one. So I keep my phone in what's called Wi-Fi calling mode, and it does work here. Are you familiar? Are people familiar with that idea? If you have your phones, why don't you take it out? It's actually, I think, worth doing it. And then you know how to get to settings. So I see people grabbing their phones. Okay, but actually it's not going to. We're going to keep it in airplane mode. But if you're going out and you push settings, then go down to where it says cellular. So I'm using an iPhone right here. So you've gone to settings, you go to cellular, and you go down to about 2/3 of the way down, and you see what says Wi-Fi calling. Turn that on. And what happens if you turn on Wi-Fi calling is that anytime your phone can't access the phone through the cellular network, it goes to the local, to any Wi-Fi that you're connected to. And so you can keep your phone, as I do, in airplane mode, but it still acts like a phone as long as I'm connected to a network, which I am at home and at work. And the importance of that is that, and I mentioned it earlier, this can go up to 3 watts of microwave power. That's significant. And it's not only going to radiate you, but others around you. But if you are using Wi-Fi calling, your maximum transmit power is around 100 milliwatts or less. 3 watts radiation, 1/10 of a watt of radiation, what's your choice? So that's one thing that you can do. Yes, sir?
Can you, if you're connected on the Ethernet, does that work?
It's funny, that's a great question, and I would have said yes before, but no, if you're connected, wired connection to Ethernet, for reasons that I can't explain, it does not work. So I'm working with people now to try to find out why it doesn't work. So if you hook up directly to Ethernet, although if you hook up directly to Ethernet, you can still do things like web browsing, and the connectors are not that expensive. I have one here, maybe I can bring it out and show people. So there's about a $10, $15 connector. You plug it right in, you plug in your Ethernet, you can also charge it up, and it works. I got a hand up, yes?
Sorry, just really quickly, because it's a similar subject. What about like Bluetooth headphones when you're using like 4G on your phone?
With wireless earbuds?
Yeah, wireless earbuds.
You're not going to like to hear this. Yeah. Somebody can provide the answers too.
Yeah, no, I heard they cause neurological brain problems, they cause they're the worst things, that the wireless ones. I've seen so many articles on it, like causing real problems.
And I've heard directly from people, including my own son, that when he would put in his wireless earbuds and he would start to get a headache, take them out, and the headache would go away. And then he would do the same thing again. What can I say?
The wired one at least is better, right? The wired.
They're slightly better.
Hollow tubes for the wired?
Yes, if you can use the hollow tube ones, so you have the transducer down here, then it runs to air tubes that go into your ear. They're reasonable quality and they're the lowest radiation, and that's what I'd recommend, particularly if you're sensitive.
Smart tubes, you say?
What are they called?
Air tubes.
Air tubes? Okay. So.
Yeah, I want to ask one more thing about the lamps. I said the lamps is also connecting to the phones and the technology of that, and the lamps are everywhere on my street anyhow. And also with the more smart devices you have, I suppose it's all increasing, right? The television,
right.
the smart meter, the lamp. But, yeah, can you tell me about the lamps exactly?
Actually, it depends. You have antennas that are mounted on masts that don't look like antennas. They look like lights.
Street lamps, yeah.
They're street lamps, and they are radiating, and that's why get a meter. Here's another idea, since we're in the library. In a number of places that I'm aware of, they were able to convince their local library to purchase meters and then loan them out, just like they loan out books. And that is what I recommend here, if you can persuade people to do that. That way you go check out a meter, and every once in a while you check it out and go look at your local environment. You like that idea? Well, it works.
All libraries do it.
You're right. I mean, these meters are not that expensive and they're really easy to use. So get them, rent a meter, borrow, steal a meter, and find out what it is in your environment that's causing a problem. Here's an example. I was in the airport waiting for my next flight before it got canceled, and I noticed I just started making readings. I pulled out my meter and it was reading 50,000 microwatts per meter squared. For those of you who know the numbers, that's really high. And then I looked up and there was a router right above me. And so I went to another part of the airport, started looking around, and I went down to the next reading, and it was 250. So you can see there's a huge variation. And so the reason I suggest getting meters is to figure out where in your house, where in your living environment, where in your workplace, the radiation is lower, and get to that place if you can.
Okay, 2 final things, and then I'm going to move on. One thing, what is the meter called exactly?
What about?
This meter, what is it called exactly? What kind of meter that
Okay, there are a number of them, thank you. So this is referred to as the Safe and Sound Pro 2, and it does both 4G and 5G. It goes up to 6 gigahertz. It's so easy to use. You turn it on, and you can have sound or not sound. In fact, let's see how they are doing right here. Anybody can use it.
Where do you buy it from?
You can get it through Amazon. Do you want to say anything about that?
No, I was just saying that
EMF protections?
I bought it directly from the company.
And last thing I'm just going to ask is, okay, if we have Wi-Fi, we have Ethernet, how much screen time would you say for kids should it be per day, in your opinion, that's safe?
Well, this is a loaded question. It's a loaded question. If with kids, with young kids below 6, I would try to have no exposure. It's zero. I mean, they were as a person who's been in education my whole life, I don't advocate electronics for young people. You know, there are ways of making things available to them that don't involve them radiating themselves.
Okay, thank you.
First, thank you so much for the insight tonight. I've got a question regarding the location of masts. Sometimes I read that it's okay to live in a building that's just under a mast. Is that true? And the second question is it safe to live 5 meters, 10 meters, 20 meters away from masts? And I think on your curve, we couldn't quite see what's going on below the 100 meters. So 100 meters is the curve showing that, for instance, it's really worse to be living 20 meters away from the mast than it would be to live 100 meters away from the mast.
That's a good question. So do you remember that image that I showed of the antenna pattern, the vertical part of the antenna pattern, where it projected the radiation down? So if you remember what that pattern looked like, and I can't bring it up right now, that directly underneath the antenna, the radiation pattern was lower. And that's why they'll tell you that. And in some cases that is true, that you're better off living underneath the antenna than away from it. But there's a caveat there, as there normally is in things like this, that when you have an antenna, it's going to be radiating right at the antenna. It's a very powerful radiation. And so what can happen is that you get that antenna pattern, which is called the side lobe of the antenna pattern, that hits something, like the roof of the building that it's mounted on. That happens a lot. And that'll cause the energy to bend around, just like light bends when it hits something, a sharp edge. It's called diffraction. And so although the radiation may be lower directly underneath the antenna, it still is most likely going to be significant, and it most definitely will be harmful. So, no, you put an antenna on my house, no flipping way.
When you go on the underground, you can have 50 people around you with mobile phones, which are active now because they've wired up a lot of the underground. Yeah. So I think we should say all the underground should be deactivated, so you can't use phones there. And secondly, when you can, I think people should turn them off and not use them at all on the underground. That's the first question. The second one is about the frequencies which are most dangerous. Could you clarify a bit on that? Because I understand if it's pulsed, you've got a higher range of frequencies, especially the higher frequencies. And the higher frequencies will give higher voltages across cell boundaries and so on. So have you got anything to say about, well, the different frequencies which are actually most dangerous?
Yes, I can. One of the first things the Commission found out is that it's not a particular frequency that causes the problem. It's the fact that you're receiving radiation at all. So anything between 300 megahertz and up into the gigahertz range, we treated it all as being the same. We would like to know more. I mean, you would think that people would have studied this before to answer your question, but we can't. Turns out that in 1996, the EPA was set up, the Environmental Protection Agency had funding, it was all set up to perform an in-depth study to answer your questions like, what's more harmful? What frequencies are more harmful? What types of modulation cause the biggest problem? But guess what? The telecommunications industry came in, did their lobbying, and got the funding removed from the Environmental Protection Agency so they no longer can perform research in that area.
Terrible.
Terrible. So I can't answer your question with any degree of granularity.
Thank you very much. Wonderful presentation. A question for anybody on the panel who's presenting today. We are seeing now in the UK antenna going onto water towers. This is the water that is feeding the population. We're having questions, those of us that look at this 5G, we've got questions. Does anybody know how that affects the water? Can you give us any more information on?
I don't have something that I can say with confidence about that. I do know about putting antennas on water towers. That happens in our country also, and I've been involved in trying to fight that. But I don't know its impact on water. And for those of you who know things about water, you know that there's a definite relationship between the quality of the water, which is on the molecular level, and exposure to things. But I can't say any more than that because I don't know.
And we are mostly water.
Yeah,
right. Cells are mostly water.
Exactly. Thanks for listening. And the more we bring this to the attention of our friends and family, the better, because it's an invisible toxin. And as has been said, it's the long-term effects which have not been tested. There's no risk assessment being done in this country in the environment whatsoever. This horrified me 4 years ago. I listened to somebody called Martin Paul, who's a specialist on the subject at a meeting I just happened to go to. And I was shocked by what I learned, rather like others here. And I just said, well, in my naivety, I just thought, well, we have to bring this to the attention of the government because clearly they're not doing their job. But of course, we then meet the mindset, the closed off, the determination really to ignore the risks. Because, as has been said, there's influence from industry, unfortunately. And there's a lot of money involved and a lot of infrastructure investment. And there's also, as Asif mentioned earlier, all the other issues. Now, none of the other things that, when I started this, none of these other things like surveillance systems, the digital ID, the NHS turning into a whole way of collecting your data and monitoring where you are, the cameras, all of it, the 15-minute neighbourhoods from which you're not meant to escape. I mean, all of these things were not happening. And now it's all coming into focus, sadly. Well, at least we now know what we're up against, and I think it's becoming clearer. And it may not be the 5G issue anymore, except that that is a pivotal point, because it's the means by which much of this can be imposed on us. But I think it's becoming obvious to a greater number of people precisely why all of these masks are going up. It's not really, in my opinion, to improve your connectivity. In fact, I find mine's deteriorated, weirdly. It's for the other purposes which we're not warned about. We were told that there was going to be an infrastructure, 5G, how wonderful it's all going to be. A lot of the energy use which is occurring is used for downloading films and for things that many of us would not think are necessary. You can actually download them much cheaper, as we've said, by wired means. You don't have to have it done by Wi-Fi. But that's a huge energy usage. And it's disinformation actually, to say it's green, because it quite clearly isn't. And then we're going to have to contend with driverless cars, electric cars, and all of these, as we know, have many more.
Erica's waiting.
Oh, okay, she's good.
Thank you very much.
A few positive points to end on about our campaign. Over 60 masts have been objected to successfully in Bristol. We can all do this, but we have to be on the case. If you want to be on the case, you can join our bi-weekly 5G Zoom group, which is on a Sunday evening, and it starts at 7, and we turn into pumpkins at 9:30, because sometimes it has been known to go on for about 4 hours. Everybody is on the case all around the country. Do not despair. The movement is getting bigger and bigger. Get yourself a meter. Show people the effects of their phone when it's turned on and when it's turned off. It's very powerful. I work always from a wired computer. I do not have a mobile. I lost it 2 weeks ago, and you know what? I don't use sat-nav either. I'm using an atlas and a piece of paper and a notepad. And I feel free. And thank you so
so much to our speakers. Thank you all for being here, and I'll hand over to Asif.
In Merton, we've achieved 80 to 85% of all the masters objected to have been refused. But what we're finding, is that, well, one response from a counsellor was, if I come to this meeting, do you supply tin-foil hats as well? And this kind of shallow response, yeah. I mean, I probably wouldn't prepare one for him as a joke, but...
I didn't understand that.
Oh, it was the same as there was a counsellor that was saying to me, if I come to this meeting, will the tin-foil hats be supplied for each person? So, I mean, given the amount of work and the eminence of the people here, it's very odd. It's like there sometimes, not all representatives, but most seem to be in a parallel universe. And we want to bridge that gap. And the way that will happen, for some reason, logical argument isn't working. It is other people writing in. So we appear to be less fringe. It's very much psychological. It's very much how appearances rather than reality. And sometimes if we talk in this very logical, irrefutable way, they won't respond. As you know, as you can see, this has been filmed today, and you can see the recording at www.fairplaynow.net. www.fairplaynow.net. And there's some cards.
Tim too for recording it.
There's cards of his. Thank you. Tim. Thank you, Drew, good for the teas. And there's some leaflets which summarise all we've talked about, very boiled down, on the tables on the front and at the back. And if you leave your names, if you want to find out more, ask questions, or help, if you need help to refuse a mast, and advice on that, put your name down, or if you want to help in any way, that would be great, because really it is a numbers game, and it is how active we are. Letter writing just by myself and a few others won't work. It will need a bit of a push. So what's happening before I go is that there's a lot to be positive about, because people are doing things and you can protect yourself. And if we get a bit formidable, as it were, we know our stuff and we all write in, then people might take a step back. And they working for us, it seems like they forget this, and if they can be the local councillors, the local council can be a bulwark against national government, who are so remote, it will help us along the way. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. It's been quite nice. Thank you, Kent. Thank you, David.